Camilla never expected anyone to stop her. Not on a morning draped in silk and gold, not when every eye was fixed on Diana, not when she believed no guard would dare move. But outside St. Paul's Cathedral, before the world's cameras, before the royal family, before history itself, Sergeant Thomas Wycliffe broke his silence. Not with spectacle, not with scandal, but with one deliberate step that turned whispers into gasps. And when he raised his hand, the moment froze, because what the guard stopped that day wasn't just Camilla's advance. It was a shadow threatening to fall over Diana's wedding itself. Now, before we show you exactly what happened on those cathedral steps, make sure you're subscribed to our channel, Guard Focus. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from, because what you're about to hear isn't gossip. It's duty, delivered in scarlet. The bells of St. Paul's Cathedral tolled over London, rolling through the summer air with a weight that seemed to stop time. Streets were packed shoulder to shoulder, families who had camped overnight, tourists waving Union Jacks, veterans in old blazers with rows of medals pinned proudly to their chests. Television cameras swung on scaffolds, reporters whispered into microphones, and the atmosphere carried a strange mixture of festival and judgment, as if the entire Commonwealth had converged to witness a single promise in scarlet and white. Outside the cathedral's great west doors, the line of royal guards stood like carved statues. Scarlet tunics blazed against the pale stone, white belts gleamed under the sun, and tall black bearskin hats crowned them in silent defiance of heat. They did not blink at the flashes of cameras. They did not stir at the pushing of the crowd. For centuries, these men had stood as the living pillars of ceremony, the unflinching image of order. Among them stood Sergeant Thomas Wycliffe of the Coldstream Guards. His posture was ramrod straight, his chin level, his eyes locked forward. He had served in Belfast and Derry, seen riots flare and fade in streets where silence was more dangerous than gunfire, but nothing, not even the weight of those tours, compared to the weight of this morning. For today the world was watching not through rifle scopes, but through millions of television screens. And a single step, a single flicker of movement could ripple into history. The crowd murmured restlessly behind the rope line, their energy surging in waves. Some whispered reverently about Diana, the shy kindergarten teacher who had captured hearts before even walking down the aisle. Others muttered with less warmth, their eyes scanning the arriving guests, searching for familiar faces, politicians, celebrities, courtiers. And then, woven into those whispers, came a sharper note, a name carried like a rumour. "Camilla, they say she's here." Wycliffe heard it in fragment, an American voice near the front, a veteran muttering behind him, a journalist scribbling too quickly in his notebook. The name rippled across the forecourt like a draught of cold air through the summer warmth. Camilla Parker Bowles. She was not on the official list of dignitaries. He knew that because he had memorized every line of the briefing the night before. But gossip was quick, and the crowd fed on it eagerly. He did not move. He did not let his eyes shift, though he felt the words land like pebbles thrown against a window. It was not his place to wonder who might arrive. His orders were simple, absolute. Maintain the boundary, hold the line, and let no one pass who had not been cleared by name. Still, as the bells continued to toll, Sergeant Wycliffe sensed it, that today, silence alone would not be enough. Something would test the line. Inside the vast stone walls of St. Paul's, the air felt altogether different. Light streamed through the high stained glass windows in coloured shafts, falling across pews filled with royalty, diplomats, and aristocracy. The scent of polished wood and candle wax mixed with expensive perfume, a heady reminder that this was not just a church service, but a spectacle of state. Pearls glimmered at throats, medals rested against crisp uniforms, and every rustle of silk seemed amplified in the hushed anticipation. On the left side of the nave, foreign dignitaries shifted in their seats. American senators, European ministers, Arab princes in embroidered robes. On the right, courtiers and senior members of the household division sat stiff-backed, faces schooled into solemn neutrality. For them, the morning was not just about Charles and Diana. It was about presenting the monarchy as a fortress of stability to allies and rivals alike. Beyond the cathedral walls, the atmosphere was raw. The streets hummed with humanity. Ordinary Londoners in their Sunday best, tourists craning for a glimpse, children perched on shoulders, waving miniature flags. Some sang softly under their breath, old hymns and ballads they half remembered from school assemblies. Others bickered over space at the rope line, elbowing for a view when the golden carriage would roll past. Between the inside and the outside stretched a line of living red, the Guards. For centuries, they had been the barrier and the bridge between royalty and the people. Motionless in their scarlet tunics, muskets gleaming at their sides, they looked less like men than incarnations of duty itself. To the crowd, they were symbols. To themselves, they were soldiers bound by one unyielding order: stillness. Sergeant Wycliffe felt that divide keenly. He knew the weight of the bear skin on his head, the cut of the tunic across his chest, the expectation of tradition pressing heavier than any rifle he'd carried in Belfast. In Northern Ireland, movement had been survival. Here, movement was disgrace. His briefing the night before had been blunt: no improvisation, no deviation. The world must see perfection. And yet, as he scanned the edges of his vision without betraying it, Wycliffe knew the world outside was far from perfect. Among the cheers, the laughter, and the sea of flags, there was a different current. The whispers of Camilla Parker Bowles had grown more insistent. He caught a sentence from a man in a grey trilby: "She's not meant to be here, not today." Another from a woman clutching binoculars: "Mark my words, she'll try." It was a delicate fault line, the difference between ceremony and scandal. Inside, the crown projected constancy. Outside, rumour threatened to fracture it. And standing at the threshold was Wycliffe, a single guardsman, silent and still, yet somehow carrying the burden of both worlds. He kept his jaw locked, his eyes forward. To any onlooker, he was stone. But inside he braced himself. He had lived long enough in service to know that moments of history rarely announce themselves. They creep, they whisper, and then, suddenly, they demand a choice. Sergeant Thomas Wycliffe had worn the uniform of the Coldstream Guards for nearly 2 decades, and every stitch of it seemed sewn into his very skin. He had marched through drizzle on Horse Guards parade, endured the weight of a bearskin under summer sun, and stood motionless through bitter winters when frost clung to the stone steps of Buckingham Palace. He was not the tallest among his regiment, nor the most decorated, but he was the one his commanders trusted when silence had to carry the message of strength. His story had begun far from St. Paul's. A coal miner's son from County Durham, he had joined the army at 18, seeking a life beyond soot and strikes. Belfast had taught him the meaning of vigilance, the way an unbuttoned jacket or a nervous glance could mark a man with explosives beneath his coat. He had seen patrols crumble under sudden fire, seen comrades carried out under sheets, and learned that stillness could be as much a shield as a rifle. Every scar on his body, from the shallow line on his cheek to the ache in his shoulder, told the story of survival through discipline. That discipline was why he stood here today, chosen for the most public of duties. His commanders knew he would not falter. He would not crane his neck for a glimpse of Diana's veil, nor twitch when tourists pushed against the ropes. His silence was not apathy, it was allegiance. To the crown, to the regiment, to the idea that Britain's strength was measured not by noise but by control. And yet, inside that rigid bearing lived a code of his own. He had buried comrades who died not because they disobeyed orders, but because someone else failed to act when the moment demanded it. He had once heard an officer say, "Better a soldier break formation than a family break apart." Those words never left him. To Wycliffe, loyalty meant protecting not just the crown's image, but its people, the vulnerable, the ones too young or too quiet to defend themselves. This morning, with the world watching, he carried that code like a hidden weapon. His scarlet tunic might have marked him as ceremonial, his stillness as ornamental, but beneath the surface lived a man honed by conflict, a man who knew the difference between ceremony and protection. As the bells of St. Paul's rang and the crowd pressed closer, Wycliffe's eyes, though fixed forward, drank in everything. The tilt of a hat, the sway of a hand, the flicker of unease across a face. He was trained to see the one detail that didn't belong, the single motion that betrayed intent. And as whispers of Camilla spread through the throng, he felt the old instincts stir. If the day came down to a choice between optics and truth, between standing still and stepping forward, he knew already which oath would guide his feet. The forecourt of St. Paul's had been a blur of polished cars and careful arrivals. Diplomats stepped out with polished shoes that gleamed under the cameras. Courtiers adjusted medals and hats as they crossed the threshold. The crowd swelled with every new face, whispering and pointing as familiar figures disappeared inside. But then the air shifted. A black sedan eased to the curb, its window glinting under the sharp summer light. Conversation thinned into murmurs, the kind that passed through a crowd like a ripple over still water. The door opened, and when she stepped out, there was no mistaking her. Camilla Parker Bowles. Her choice of dress was deliberate. Cream, understated, crowned with a small hat and veil that offered a thin shield of anonymity. To the inattentive eye, she might have blended with the sea of aristocrats and social acquaintances. But to those who knew, her face carried a weight that no veil could obscure. For months, her name had been whispered in tabloids and households, the shadow presence in Charles's life. And here, on the morning of his marriage to Diana, her very appearance was a provocation. Gasps rose at once, muffled but undeniable. Photographers swung their cameras like hunting dogs catching scent, lenses clicking furiously. Aides stiffened on the cathedral steps, unsure whether to greet her or intercept. Some turned to each other with expressions caught between disbelief and dread. Camilla did not falter. Her chin lifted slightly, her stride measured as she moved toward the guests already entering the doors. Every step seemed to test the air itself, daring anyone to challenge her. Sergeant Wycliffe watched from his post, though no one would have known it. His eyes, trained to remain still, picked up every detail. The tilt of her hat, the tension in her jaw, the purposeful angle of her walk, less like a guest seeking a seat and more like a claimant crossing a boundary. He recalled the briefing, names memorized, guest lists checked twice. Hers had not been among them, and yet here she was, advancing toward the cathedral as though it were her right. Around him the whispers swelled. She wouldn't. Not today. Is she really? A veteran near the rope line muttered, "This'll make the papers before the vows are said." Wycliffe did not blink. He knew the danger here was not of violence but of spectacle. A single photograph, Camilla brushing shoulders with Diana on the steps, even for a moment, could poison the very image the monarchy was desperate to project. His orders had been clear: no intrusions, no deviations, no disruption of the ceremony. Camilla drew closer, and the divide between rumour and reality vanished. The crowd's murmur thickened into a low roar of unease. Photographers jostled for angle. Guests shuffled nervously, some pretending not to notice, others staring openly. And yet no aide moved forward, no courtier raised a hand. She was too socially powerful to confront, too entangled in Charles's life for anyone to risk public insult, except for one man in scarlet. Wycliffe's pulse slowed, as it always had in Belfast before a decision. He measured the distance, 3 paces from the rope line, 5 from the cathedral doors. She was walking with the assurance of someone convinced no one would dare stand in her way. His gloved fingers curled once against the hilt of his rifle, then stilled. He did not yet move, but every muscle in his body coiled with readiness. The moment was coming, the one his oath had prepared him for, even if his orders had not. Camilla's heel touched the stone past the rope line, and Sergeant Wycliffe knew the line had been crossed. The cathedral forecourt had been noisy only moments before. Chatter, camera shutters, the scrape of polished shoes on stone. But when Camilla's heel crossed the rope line, a hush spread like smoke through the crowd. It wasn't silence, so much as suspended breath, thousands of lungs caught in the same uneasy pause. The rope itself sagged uselessly behind her, no longer a barrier, but a symbol of the rules she had chosen to ignore. Her veil stirred faintly in the breeze, the pale cream fabric catching the light as she moved with deliberate calm toward the cathedral doors. Each step sounded louder than it should have, sharp against the stone, echoing in ears already tuned to scandal. Guests, standing near the entry, froze in place. Some turned instinctively away, as though looking elsewhere might absolve them of responsibility. Others watched wide-eyed, knowing full well the magnitude of what was happening. The woman rumoured to haunt the prince's affection was walking uninvited toward the threshold of his marriage. And still, no aid moved, no official interjected. For them, it was a political minefield, too dangerous to act, too public to ignore. But for Sergeant Wycliffe, the equation was simpler. The ceremonial line had been crossed, and with it, his orders. He had been told no one was to pass who was not named. Whatever her standing, whatever whispers clung to her, she was not cleared. He drew one step forward. It was measured, precise, the kind of step that carried centuries of tradition in its heel. Yet to the crowd, it was like thunder. Gasps broke out, scattered but sharp, at the sight of a guardsman moving without command. Cameras flashed at once, eager to capture the rarest of sights, scarlet, breaking stillness. Wycliffe's bare skin cast a long shadow across the paving stones as he placed himself directly in Camilla's path. His left hand lowered slightly, palm out, a gesture of halt, so crisp it might have been carved into stone. His rifle remained angled, untouched, but his body alone became a wall. "Madam," he said quietly, his voice low but unmistakably firm, "you may not proceed." Camilla stopped mid-step. For the first time her poise faltered, if only by a fraction. Her eyes lifted toward his face, scanning for weakness behind the immovable mask. "Do you know who I am?" she asked, her tone measured, not raised, but edged with a challenge honed by years of moving in corridors of power. "Yes, ma'am," Wycliffe replied, his words crisp as the medals on his chest. "And I also know my orders. No one passes without clearance." The crowd's silence thickened, as though the stones themselves were holding their breath. Even the reporters, pens poised, seemed hesitant to scratch their notes too loudly. For a moment, Camilla's lips parted as though she might push further. But the sight before her was unyielding. A guardsman who did not blink, who did not fidget, who stood like the embodiment of tradition itself. Between them hung the weight of centuries, protocol, duty, scandal, power, all condensed into the space of a single step. And for the first time that morning, it was not the bride's arrival, nor the bells, nor the carriages that held the world's attention. It was the silent standoff between a queen in waiting and a guardsman who refused to move aside. The pause stretched so long it seemed to bend the air itself. Cameras clicked in frantic bursts, each flash freezing the tableau. Camilla, in her cream suit, veil tilted back just enough to reveal the taut set of her jaw, and Sergeant Wycliffe standing before her like a stone pillar wrapped in scarlet. She drew herself up, smoothing a hand against her jacket as if brushing away dust. Her voice, when it came, was calm and deliberate, pitched for those nearest to hear, but quiet enough to feel private. "You presume too much," she said, her tone carrying the faint lilt of disbelief, as though the very idea of being stopped was absurd. "This is not a parade ground. It is a wedding. His wedding." Wycliffe's reply came without hesitation. "My duty is the same in both, ma'am. Orders are clear. No entry without clearance." The words were simple, but their weight carried. They were not defiance for its own sake, nor insolence. They were the kind of response only a soldier could give, loyalty expressed as obedience to something larger than either of them. Camilla tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. "Do you understand who I am to him?" For a moment, it was as if the whole forecourt leaned in, waiting for his answer. "Yes, ma'am," he said again, voice steady as a drumbeat, "and it changes nothing." A ripple of murmurs ran through the guests at the doorway. Aides exchanged sharp looks, some half rising as though they might intervene, only to settle back. It was too dangerous. To step between them now would mean choosing sides in front of the world's cameras. And no aide wished their name to be the one splashed across headlines the next morning. Camilla's lips pressed into a thin line. She shifted her weight forward slightly, as if to test the space between them. But Wycliffe did not yield an inch. His gloved hand remained raised, the smallest barrier, but one backed by centuries of discipline and the authority of the uniform. The silence deepened into tension. To the crowd, it was no longer just a man and a woman. It was tradition itself, standing against intrusion. Every flash of scarlet on Wycliffe's chest, every line of his tunic, seemed to embody the message. The monarchy's dignity would not be compromised. Not today. Camilla's voice softened, almost coaxing now. You're just a guardsman. One step aside and no one will question you. It was a dangerous suggestion wrapped in gentleness, but Wycliffe heard it differently. He thought of Belfast, of an officer once telling him, better a soldier break formation than a family break apart. He thought of Diana, the young bride about to walk up the steps, and of what this moment could become if tainted by scandal. His reply was quiet, but it carried into every corner of the forecourt. Ma'am, he said, I stand so she may walk. The words landed like a gavel. They were not shouted, not emotional, but calm, an oath expressed in plain speech. The crowd exhaled as though something had broken. Guests exchanged startled glances. Even the photographers paused, sensing that what they had just captured was no ordinary confrontation. Camilla's eyes flashed with something unreadable. Anger, perhaps, or the recognition that she could not win this battle without turning the day into chaos. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped back half a pace. The move was slight, but it was enough. Wycliffe did not press forward, did not gloat, did not move again. He simply lowered his hand, returned it to his side, and resumed his stance, still as stone as though nothing had happened. But everyone watching knew that something had happened, something that could never be undone. The guard had intervened, and for the first time that morning, Diana's path remained hers alone. For a long moment, after Camilla stepped back, the air remained taut, as though the entire forecourt balanced on the edge of a knife. The crowd had seen a guardsman move, had heard him speak, and yet there was no laughter, no jeering, no eruption of outrage. Instead, there was a strange, reverent silence. The kind that comes when people realize they've witnessed something far larger than a minor disruption. Camilla stood poised, veil shadowing her face, but the steel in her eyes had dulled. She adjusted the cuff of her jacket with exaggerated calm, as though the smallest ritual of composure could erase what had just occurred. Yet her hesitation betrayed her. The woman who had walked forward with such certainty now lingered one step behind the line, caught between retreat and defiance, aware that the world's cameras had not missed a thing. Wycliffe remained still. To the casual eye, he had returned to his role, posture perfect, rifle untouched. But within him, the weight pressed heavy. He knew the line he had crossed was not just the rope barrier on the stone, it was the invisible line between ceremonial silence and personal judgment. He had been ordered to enforce the boundary, yes, but in choosing to act, he had defied the expectation that a guardsman would ignore what protocol could not neatly contain. He thought of Belfast, of a boy who once slipped past a cordon because a young soldier hesitated, unsure whether to intervene. Minutes later, the explosion tore through a side street, killing 2 and scarring more for life. The lesson etched itself into Wycliffe's bones. Hesitation cost lives. It was a lesson that had never left him, even here, in scarlet and bearskin, rather than combat green. What was at stake this morning was not lives in the same sense. It was something different, yet equally fragile, the sanctity of a moment the world had gathered to witness. The sight of Diana, radiant and hopeful, stepping into her new life, could not be marred by scandalous whispers made flesh on the cathedral steps. Wycliffe understood that, better than any aide, any courtier, too fearful of consequence to intervene. To the crowd, his action was not rebellion, it was clarity. The line mattered, ceremony mattered, respect mattered. And if no one else had the courage to hold that truth in place, then a guardsman would. A low murmur spread among the veterans clustered behind the rope. One man, hair silver under his bowler, leaned to another and whispered, "That's what service looks like." Wycliffe heard none of it. His eyes were forward, his expression unbroken. Yet inside he carried the knowledge that his decision had cost him something. He would be noticed now by commanders, by aides, perhaps even by the palace itself. Guards were not meant to be remembered individually. They were meant to be faceless, interchangeable, the scarlet blur of constancy. And yet, after today, he would not be faceless. The thought did not frighten him. He had already chosen which oath he valued most. If the price of loyalty was to stand alone against power, then he would pay it. And in that moment, as the bells of St. Paul's pealed again, Sergeant Wycliffe knew the weight of his stillness had never been heavier or more necessary. The bells struck again, louder this time, rolling through the city in waves. The crowd, tense from the confrontation, turned almost as one toward the street as the sound of hooves and wheels echoed on the stone. The golden carriage came into view, sunlight spilling across its polished frame until it seemed to glow. Flags lifted, cheers broke out, and the tension in the air fractured into a roar of anticipation. Diana had arrived. Inside the carriage, her veil shimmered like mist over water, trailing down across the folds of her ivory gown. The people surged forward as far as the ropes would allow, voices rising in waves of joy, chants of her name swelling into the London air. Cameras snapped furiously, desperate to capture every second, every angle of the bride, who had already captured the hearts of millions. And in that surge of adoration, Camilla's position became untenable. Moments earlier, she had stood defiant at the rope line, pressing forward as though daring anyone to stop her. Now, with the golden carriage cresting the forecourt, her presence was no longer just inappropriate, it was incendiary. To push on now, even by a single step, would not just disrupt ceremony. It would be a scandal visible in every corner of the globe. She knew it, and so did everyone watching. Her eyes flicked once towards Sergeant Wycliffe, who had not moved since lowering his hand. His scarlet figure blocked the path as firmly as the cathedral doors themselves. He did not glare, did not smirk. He simply stood, still as stone, the embodiment of the monarchy's line between dignity and disorder. Camilla's lips parted slightly, then pressed closed again. Slowly, so subtly that the crowd might not even notice, she shifted her foot back, retreating across the rope line she had once crossed with such certainty. The act was slight, but its meaning was vast. She had yielded, not to an aide or a courtier, but to a single guardsman who refused to bend. The crowd's focus turned wholly toward Diana. They surged with cheers as she stepped down from the carriage, her gown spilling across the steps like a wave of white silk. Trumpets blared, bells thundered, and the cameras found their true subject. For a few minutes, the confrontation was swallowed by the pageantry of history. But for those who had seen, the memory lingered. They knew the wedding could have begun under a cloud of whispered scandal. Instead, it began with a young bride unshadowed, because one man in scarlet had chosen not to yield. Wycliffe did not bask in it. He simply resumed his post, rifle angled precisely, eyes locked forward. To the world, he was again faceless, one of many in a wall of tradition, but to those nearest, his silent defiance was unforgettable. Camilla stepped back into the sea of guests, her expression carefully composed. Yet the faint tension in her jaw betrayed the truth. She had been stopped, not by courtiers or monarchs, but by discipline itself. And in that instant, the balance of power had shifted, not through titles or crowns, but through the stillness of a single guardsman. The roar of the crowd swelled until it seemed to shake the very stone of St. Paul. Trumpets blared from the balcony, their golden notes soaring above the cheers as Diana, radiant in white, stepped from the carriage. Her gown cascaded down in a long, sweeping train that glimmered in the sunlight, every fold and stitch catching the flash of cameras. Children perched on shoulders waved their flags so hard their arms trembled. Veterans who had stood stiff-backed all morning allowed themselves faint smiles, as though reassured that even amidst the noise, something pure still held. The world's eyes, the world's hopes, were fastened now on the young bride walking steadily toward the cathedral steps. Sergeant Wycliffe did not move. He remained a scarlet silhouette at the periphery, rifle angled, posture unbroken. Yet he knew his role had shifted. Moments before, his presence had been a barrier, a line drawn against intrusion. Now it was something quieter, a reassurance that the sanctity of this moment would hold. No one watching the bride's steps would ever know how close the scene had come to being spoiled. No one, save those who had seen the cream veil hesitate at the rope line. Camilla was among them still, her presence carefully muted by the tide of guests filing into the cathedral. To many, she was invisible again, her cream suit blending into the background of pearls and polished shoes. But to those who had witnessed the confrontation, her retreat was indelible. She had tried, and she had been stopped, not by whispers, not by scandal, but by one man in scarlet who refused to let tradition bend. The bells tolled louder as Diana reached the doors. Courtiers adjusted her train, pages smoothed the silk, and the hush inside the cathedral swelled as anticipation reached its peak. For a moment, the boundary between inside and outside blurred, cheers echoing through stone, organ notes spilling out into sunlight. Wycliffe's eyes remained forward, but in the corner of his vision he caught the faint shimmer of the bride's veil as she passed into the cathedral. It was enough. The day belonged to her, unbroken. The world would remember the vows, the music, the kiss on the balcony. Few would speak of the moment at the rope line, the quiet defiance that preserved the dignity of the morning. But Wycliffe knew, the veterans at the barrier knew, even some courtiers who dared not act knew. Ceremony had been restored, order had held, and for Sergeant Wycliffe, still as stone beneath the weight of his bearskin, that was victory enough. As the cathedral doors closed behind Diana, the noise of the crowd softened into a steady murmur. The wedding had claimed its place in history, the ceremony secured. The cheers and the music belonged to the bride and groom, but out on the steps, one guardsman remained rooted to his post. Sergeant Thomas Wycliffe stood as he always had, motionless, eyes forward, rifle angled with perfect precision. To the crowd, he was one of many, indistinguishable in scarlet and bearskin. Yet to those who had seen, he was unforgettable. They would remember how the line had held, how tradition had not bent, how a single soldier had blocked the path that threatened to overshadow the day. Camilla had melted back into the tide of guests, her cream suit vanishing among pearls and medals. The attempt was over, reduced to whispers that would never reach the front pages. The bride's dignity remained intact, the monarchy's image preserved. And the guard? He resumed silence, just another pillar of ceremony, as if nothing had ever happened. But those who knew better would never forget that sometimes history turns not on speeches or crowns, but on the stillness of one man in scarlet who chose to hold the line. Do you think Sergeant Wycliffe was right to block Camilla, even knowing the risk to his own career? Should a guardsman's duty to protocol outweigh the social standing of those who test it? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Make sure you hit the like button, subscribe with the bell turned on, and share this story with someone who believes the guards are just ceremony. Another story is waiting for you right now. Tap it on your screen and I'll see you tomorrow, same time, with something new.